Welcome to Best Practices for Tutoring ESL Students. This is Tim, and we're going to talk about tutoring ESL students. Before we get started, I want to say a quick word about the terminology that I'm going to use here. You can see I've already used the acronym ESL. I'm going to use that to mean anybody who does not speak English as their first language. So it's not the first language they learn. If somebody learns Swahili and then they learn French and then they learn English, I would still be calling them an ESL student for the purposes of this presentation. I'll be using the designator L1 to indicate someone's first language. So some people call this a native language. I feel like that's a little problematic. So we're going to go with L1. So for me, my L1 is English. And for someone who grew up in Mexico and learned first, their L1 was Spanish, and then they came to the United States and started to learn English. They would be an ESL writer from my perspective. I wanted to do some true or false to start, to kind of get us primed for thinking about this. So read through these. They're on your handout as well. And then just take a moment, and if you want to mark down which ones you think are true or false, or you want to just think about it, please do that. And if you want to pause, this is a great place to do it, and we'll pick up in just a second. Okay, we're back, and we'll go to the next slide. There's a bunch of data here, and I'll just summarize it for you quickly. ESL students are overwhelmingly likely to be immigrants, and they are overwhelmingly likely to be community college students. Most ESL students, most immigrants, do not seek bachelor's degrees in the U.S. They tend to go for certificate or associate's programs. And community colleges get the brunt of ESL students. More than a quarter of community college students nationwide are immigrants. The other thing to know is that there's a range of 14, within the last 5 years, there's a range of 14 to 44 years. So if a person immigrates to the United States between the ages of 14 and 44, that person has one of the lowest rates of education. So they're less likely to finish their education than people who immigrate at other ages. People who immigrate younger than that are more likely to be prepared for college. People who immigrate older than that are more likely to have very little, to have the lowest education of any immigrant group. And this data is from the Community College Consortium for Immigrant Education. If you're interested in this, there's more there. So I would encourage you to look at that if you're interested. So how do we tutor ESL students? Well, here are some things to do. So these are the good things. The first thing, and none of this is super surprising. A lot of this is stuff that we know, or it's stuff that we learned in a lower CRLA level course. So we're going to set a goal. This is the same thing with an ESL student. Learn what they want to get out of the session so that you can start where they are and trust them. They know what they're struggling with in English. They're probably brutally aware of their struggles with the language. And we want to avoid kind of diagnosing them very quickly and deciding, oh, well, this person comes from a Latin American country, so they speak Spanish, so they're going to drop their subjects all the time and just start sentences with verbs. So that's what I need to look out for. Let them tell you where they need help, and then give them the help where they want it. Use honest check-ins. There can sometimes be cultural issues with ESL students, and it may not be appropriate for them to ask questions if they're not prompted. It may not be appropriate in their culture for them to question someone in a position of authority. It may be appropriate in their culture to simply defer to authority no matter what is said. So be aware of the cultural competence issues, and they go hand in hand with the ESL issues often, and make sure that you're getting kind of genuine feedback from them about how it's going. Get them talking. Again, this is nothing new, but get them talking. The conversation is good practice for them, but it also gets them engaged in the session. And we'll talk more about why that's important in just a minute. When we talk about what works and doesn't work, one of the things that's going to happen in an ESL session, to back up for a second, one of the things that's going to happen is the student and the tutor are both at some point probably going to have to deal with sentence level issues. And when we deal with those sentence level issues, whether they're grammatical or mechanical or stylistic, whatever it is, we want to make sure that we're describing things in terms of utility. So here's why it works better this way. Here's why it doesn't work so well that way. So it's not just about a comma goes here, that's how it is in English, get over it. It's about, well, we put a comma here because if we don't, then the reader might not know that this thing is connected to that thing or that this thing's not connected to that thing. One thing to do, and this is a little controversial, the next bullet is I say explain the mode or structure the student is expected to use. Not every culture holds the 5-paragraph essay to the same level of importance as we do. Honestly, at a lot of universities, this idea instructors would probably be taught, particularly those who teach ESL courses, they would be taught and told not to do this, not to force modes or structures onto students, to instead let them kind of structure or organize a paper the way that they want to. That's not the case here at ECC, and I think that people do really expect a certain kind of structure. And so I would encourage you to as much as you can, help the student meet the assignment guidelines while preserving their own voice and their own sense of style or organization. If you want more information about this, I have a slide at the very end of the presentation that contains 2 great resources that explain a little bit more about this kind of problematic issue that we have writing between cultures, and it might give you some additional things to think about. So I've already mentioned this, but trust the student. They know what they need. Here are some things to avoid. Pretty simple. Avoid lecturing on the English language. I sometimes halfway jokingly tell students that the only thing more boring than listening to somebody lecture you about the English language is being the person who does the lecturing about the English language. And that's not strictly true. I know some of us like to talk about language, but nobody wants to just sit for 30 minutes and have somebody rip apart their paper in terms of grammar. It's, that's not probably what they're looking for. So what you can do instead is, again, use that utility speak. Tell them why it is the way it is. As much as you can, try to give them intervention at different levels. So what I mean by that is, don't just concentrate on grammar. Whatever you see is the thing. It is completely okay to deal with grammar with any student when it inhibits clarity. And that is, for a lot of ESL students, going to be where the real issue is. It's not just that they drop their subjects. It's not just that the verbs aren't in the right tense. It's that in a narrative, tense is incredibly important. In a lot of writing, tense is incredibly important. That's why it's so important in languages. So get them where they are and give them the intervention that is the intervention that they need at that point in time. I already mentioned don't rush to diagnose based solely on their language. These problems that we think of as being kind of archetypal problems for a certain language, there is some regularity in those problems, but it may not just be that. It could be something else. It could be that they know the right rule, that they were told a rule, but it's the wrong rule. So they are perfectly following an incorrect rule. Notice that as there are, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but there are lots of places that offer ESL training where that training is maybe a little suspicious. When I was a kid, I know that the church that I grew up in had an ESL program for the Mexican Americans who were in our community. And the people who were teaching the ESL classes, in retrospect, probably had no business teaching English classes. So you don't know where this stuff is coming from. So make sure that you give each student their own diagnosis, and that we're not reading into the paper what we think is there based on their cultural background or their language background. One thing that we often do for English students that's not for L1 English students that's not helpful for ESL students is ask them to read out loud. It can be helpful for them to gain fluency in reading if we have them read out loud, but it will not help them spot grammatical, mechanical, stylistic problems. They don't know what the language should sound like. And in fact, some of them write the way that they speak. And that's part of the problem because they're trying to translate conversational English into spoken English. And we all know that that's not what you do. That's not how you write. So be aware, be careful about telling them to read things out loud. One thing that I think might have some marginal positive effect would be to help them correct a sentence and then have them read that sentence out loud to get familiar with how it sounds when it's quote unquote right or when it's maybe revised a little better than it was before. The Online Writing Center presents a host of unique difficulties for students at all levels, and this is especially true with ESL students. These are some helpful hints that I have for what it's worth. Some of these are based on the work of Rilling or Riling, I'm not sure how you say it, and you can find that article in my references page. One thing is avoid encouraging them to read their work out loud. We just talked about this. Use short, concise sentences. So this is true across the board, but it's especially true with ESL writers. Be very careful of vocabulary. Vocabulary is kind of one of the last things that, vocabulary is one of the last milestones to fluency. And so even somebody who is very advanced as a writer, don't assume that that means that they have a good vocabulary because it may not mean that at all. So be cautious and careful of sentence structure and syntax of your own, but also be careful that you're not using words that they probably don't have in their vocabulary. This was really interesting to me from this article. They said to make a clear distinction between correctness and prompting. Or I'm sorry, prompting for correctness and prompting for style. And so if you're giving them a grammatical rule, something that is set in stone, make that clear that this is kind of the way it is. You do it this way. If you're just saying, well, it may sound better if you did this, or, this word choice may be slightly better, let them know that that is not necessarily a rule. And then make sure that when you're working with grammar mechanics, which as we've already said will happen, make sure that you're leaving room for them to make the corrections. That's the best way for them to learn. Point out a couple, then let them do the next, and then check in every once in a while if you see it again. I will sometimes do like 2 I'll correct. I'll point out a third. I'll let 2 go by, and then I'll correct another one. Maybe that's the third one after the 2 go by, if that makes sense. So I'm kind of checking in, and I'll do that as I go just to make sure they're still looking for it. And then encourage resubmission. These students, ESL students, learn really well when they can see correction. I think everybody does, but especially this is especially helpful for people who are coming at it from a new language or a fluency standpoint. It works really well if they can see multiple submissions and work with the same person throughout the process. That can be really helpful for them. So true or false, let's check back in and see how we did. Again, I don't know that there's not data backing up each of these claims that I'm going to make, but this is my conjecture about whether these things are true or false. So ESL writers want to concentrate on lower order concerns. It's kind of false. I think they want to concentrate on these concerns, but their main concern is that they want their language to be clear and understandable. And to me, if grammar is obscuring clarity, then it is a high order concern at that point, because clarity and understandability are essential to writing. It's why we write. Knowing that ESL writers L1 will improve our sessions, it's actually not true. Tonus says that because advanced ESL writers are more limited by vocabulary than syntax, it doesn't really help to relate back to their original language. There's not really a connection there. Most ESL writers are literate in their L1. This is one that I would have assumed. I just feel like, that they're going to know their own language, but it's not true. ESL writers come, as we saw in the demographic slide, they come from a broad spectrum of academic levels and backgrounds. And it is not uncommon for ESL writers to not have a high school diploma even in their own country. And then on the other side, it is common for them to have a bachelor's degree. On the other hand, though, we have no reason to expect that educational systems in other countries are vastly different than ours. And so we know that there are people with bachelor's degrees here who still may struggle to write a complete sentence or to write a totally coherent essay. And I'm not picking on anybody. It's just that's a thing that people struggle with. And so it's going to be a struggle, I think, across any culture. So don't assume literacy, even in their first language. So tutoring should be done only in the same language as the paper. This is an interesting one. Multi-language tutors have been shown to have superior skills in grammar explanation than native speakers. So it may be the case that multi-language tutors, and I know that at this point, I believe all of the writing tutors here speak a second language. And though that is one of the things that makes tutors better at explaining those kind of differences in language, because they've gone through that process of assimilating the syntax and the vocabulary and the differences in sound of a new language, and so they can pass that on to a tutee that they work with. But it's not the case that we need to speak in English. If we had a tutor who was fluent in Spanish and we had a Spanish-speaking student, it may be a good idea when there are moments of confusion or moments where the English is a barrier to go into that other language. And in fact, if you look on my recommended reading or my recommended references slide at the end here, and you go to the Ohio University one about being an ally, you'll find an example of this very thing where I believe they're Chinese students, go to Chinese from English to explain what the meaning of the word cosmopolitan is. And it just appears that it's easier for them to do it in their first language. But then when they're done, they come back to English. So this is an interesting thing. I say this one is false. This would be something that would be interesting to look more into. So here are my references, and I'll go to really quickly through this one to my recommended resources. Again, I would recommend either of these. I would recommend both of them. Writing Across Borders is a little bit older, and it comes across as just as a touch dated, but I think that it has just superb material in it. So check out either one of those. I would encourage you to do that. And let me know if you have any questions, or I would love to talk about this stuff more. I'm still learning. This is really one of the first times that I have kind of looked deeply into the literature, maybe not deeply, but that I've looked into the literature about tutoring ESL writers. And I'm both excited by how much there is, and then I'm also a little disappointed that there's not as much rigor as I had hoped for. So there are fewer kind of studies and things like that. So if any of you have any good recommendations of things I could read, if you have any other resources you think that I would enjoy, please send those my way. Thanks for staying with me, and happy CRLA being over. Thanks.